Is this $20,000 Rolex truly 200 times better than this Pagani GMT? Is what I would say if I wanted to point out the obvious. So instead, I'll be comparing the Pagani GMT and the Rolex GMT by pointing out the refinements that the Rolex has compared to its Pagani counterpart, and then I'll also be mentioning the surprising upper hand Pagani has in this fight. I'll try to characterize the different type of buyers, and finally I'll try to harmonize the Rolex wearers and the Pagani design wearers who are in constant disagreement with an argument that I don't think is brought up enough in this space. Not surprisingly, the Pagani has a very similar design to the Rolex GMT because the employees there make amazing use of their trusty tool, the photocopier. So they both use a 24-hour GMT bezel insert. They both have a GMT accented hand, both have a 2.5 times magnified cyclops onto the right side of the dial, both have black dials with white luminous markers, both obviously are GMTs, and both use a sapphire crystal. And of course, when we're discussing the surface level similarities, the Rolex almost outdoes the Pagani in every single way. But yeah, I'd hope so if you're paying 200 times the Pagani. The dimensions of both of the watches are at 40 millimeters in terms of the diameter. They're both 48 millimeters in terms of lug to lug, and they're both around 150 grams in terms of weight. Both take 20 millimeter straps. They're almost identical in the raw dimensions, and if you're walking down the streets and you didn't know any better, you'd think that the Pagani is a Rolex GMT. Firstly, the Pagani uses a more cushion-like case shape, whereas the Rolex has a slimmer design, which in my opinion makes the Pagani look more tooly and the Rolex a lot more versatile because it can be used in more formal outings. Also, the Pagani has a much larger crown. It's quite noticeable and it sort of protrudes on the wrist. In my opinion, it means that it's a lot easier to wind the watch. It's a lot easier to set the time, but aesthetically, it's not that great. Also, the Pagani has a sort of floating on your wrist type effect because the back half of the case protrudes. Also, the Pagani has a different bezel technology. It uses a 120 click unidirectional bezel, whereas the Rolex uses a 24-hour bidirectional bezel. One thing I was surprised by was the fact that the Rolex bezel doesn't actually have an audible sound. The Pagani is a lot less intuitive because it uses a 120 click bezel, and that isn't typically what you would use on a GMT. It's because they wanted to cut costs because they used the same bezel technology in their Submariners and their whole other line of watches. Also, in terms of bezel material, it is different because the Pagani uses either aluminum or ceramic with their Batman. Rolex only uses Cerachrome. It's a mixture of ceramic and it's a lot stronger than ceramic. The reason that the Pagani does not use ceramic for the Pepsi bezel is because it's actually quite difficult to produce a bicolored Pepsi bezel, and it's not just Pagani who struggles with it, it's the whole market including Rolex, so I wouldn't dock too many points from Pagani for doing that. But of course, you're getting a better quality bezel and a more intuitive bezel with the Rolex. Also, the bracelets are different. The Pagani bracelets, I would say, are a lot worse because the articulation of the links is not as smooth, right? And that's to be expected, but sometimes it gets stuck. And also, I find specifically with the Jubilee bracelet, I found that the inner part of the bracelet that's actually touching your wrist to be quite sharp versus the Rolex, which doesn't have that. And also the Pagani clasp is very sharp. You could cut paper with it. The Rolex is a lot more refined and they have softer edges. Even though it's a sports watch, it still is refined. Additionally, the Rolex uses white gold for their markers. Pagani does not do that. They use stainless steel. And also, if we're talking different materials. The Pagani design uses 316L stainless steel, which is obviously inferior to Rolex's 904L steel. Rolex uses 904L steel, which is superior to Pagani's 316L steel. Of course, these are just ways that Rolex one-ups Pagani. Both brands claim that their watches can withstand up to 100 meters of water. Now, obviously, I would not trust Pagani Design's stamp of approval because it's a Chinese factory that nobody really holds accountable, whereas Rolex is a very popular brand that if their watches did not live up to their stated standards, it would not be good for Rolex. Also, if you are enjoying this video, I would really appreciate if you liked, commented, subscribed. It'd be very, very helpful for this channel. As always, I'll be trying my best to respond to each and every comment, and as my videos get more comments, it's getting a little bit harder to respond to each and every one of them, but I will try to remain diligent. And I also just want to thank you all for supporting me up to this point in my journey. I've had a lot of fun making these videos, and I hope to continue. Since this is the updated GMT Master 2 with the Jubilee bracelet on the Batman, reference 126710 BLNR, so it uses the caliber 3285, whereas the Pagani design uses the trusty Seiko NH35. And in terms of stated accuracies, the Rolex 3285 runs at -2 seconds to +2 seconds per day within cost standards, and the Pagani design runs at the stated accuracies of -20 to +40 seconds a day. But you know, if we're being honest here, the Seiko NH movements are so much better than their stated accuracies. Personally, this watch, the NH34 powered Pagani, runs at around +3 seconds per day. This Pagani comes with a pearl Chinese movement, but for the sake of this video, we'll be comparing the Seiko movement Pagani. The Rolex has a 70-hour power reserve, whereas the Pagani has a 40-hour power reserve. The Rolex runs at 4 Hz, whereas the Pagani runs at 3 Hz. These sort of differences may matter to a select few because the seconds hand is a little bit smoother with the Rolex. In terms of the different types of GMT, the Rolex GMT uses a true GMT movement, meaning that you can quickly set the local hour hand, versus the collar GMT that the NH34 is, so you can quickly set the GMT hand. And personally, I find the collar GMT to be a lot more useful because I'm not traveling as much as I am contacting other people who are in different time zones. The magnetic resistance, I could not find specific numbers on it, but the Rolex is just overall better. Their movements have been tested for so much magnetic resistance that I would trust it, versus the Seiko movements, which again are quite workhorse movements, nothing compared to the Rolex movements. Now, here's something interesting that I don't think many reviewers point out, and that's the upper hand that Pagani has. Again, it's not a huge upper hand, but it's something. It's the fact that the Seiko NH34 has a quick set date, whereas the Rolex GMT Batman, the one I'm talking about, does not have a quick set date. It may not be a big deal for some of you. It's a big deal for me because I wear a few watches. The fact that a Pagani design beats out a Rolex in one aspect is still astonishing nonetheless. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the backstory behind this particular Rolex. So if it wasn't obvious, I don't have the money to buy a Rolex, so I'm very, very thankful for my uncle who had lent this in for review, because it meant that I could compare these two drastically differently priced watches side by side. So in terms of this particular watch's backstory, he had bought it after my grandfather and his father had passed away. And he really isn't afraid of wear and tear. He wears it up to the cottage and on boats. And so the reason I say this is to obviously mention my uncle who who lent in this watch, but also to dispel the stereotypes surrounding the average Rolex buyer, because there tends to be a belief that almost every Rolex wearer is just there to flaunt their wealth and they frivolously buy these luxury watches. But I wanted to point out that there is a large group of people who purchase these Rolexes because of the reputation, because of what it means to them, because of the sentimentality of the watches. This GMT carries the immense historical baggage that the brand Rolex has. The brand is notorious for doing some amazing marketing stunts. They were the first watch to be on Mount Everest, supposedly, and also they were the first watch to be submerged underwater while the swimmer was swimming the English Channel. This Rolex was created during the popularization of commercial flying, so it has that running for it. If you want a in-depth video about the Rolex brand, I would definitely be open to that, so tell me in the comments. But that, in comparison to Pagani Design's lack of history, is actually quite impressive, because if you look at Pagani Design's heritage, it's basically none outside of the Chinese factory they're all produced in. The way that I see it is this Rolex GMT is not objectively 200 times better than the Pagani design, and if that wasn't obvious from the start, I mean, it should be obvious by now. These two watches are marketed to very different demographics, unless you're the type of person who aspires to have a Rolex GMT like me and is also interested in homages, or was interested in sort of clomages. Generally, the way I see it is that the clomage homage buyer is more concerned with the more objective aspects of a watch that comes down to materials, movement, and design. And they don't really value the historicity of a particular brand, a particular movement, etc., etc. And to an extent, I understand that. I do think that a lot of the horology and heritage behind these brands are a way to sort of justify the exorbitant prices some of these brands are charging for their watches. So I do understand that argument. I think the different mindset disparities are exemplified in the different type of watch wearers. So for instance, me as a Pagani design wearer, I wear this Pagani design on a NATO because I think I want to tone it down a bit, and it doesn't really affect my wearing experience compared to my uncle, who prefers to wear his Batgirl on a Jubilee bracelet. It comes down to the fact that the Jubilee bracelet is a really iconic aspect of the Rolex design. It's something that it's really important to that brand, whereas I have less of a connection to Pagani design as a brand. That's why I'm really willy-nilly as to taking off the bracelet and just putting it on a NATO. Also, I do understand the sentimental aspect from the luxury buyer's perspective, because from my uncle's perspective, when I had a conversation with him about why he bought a Rolex, it was because Rolex is known for making very, very durable watches, and the watches are very recognizable and they do carry some status. You know, I think everyone here would be lying if they said they buy everything purely for utility. Part of a product is the way it makes you feel. My argument that I think isn't brought up a whole bunch in this sort of space is the fact that if you're purchasing a watch in the 21st century where quartz exists, both of you are unreasonable. If you're buying a mechanical watch, whether that be a Pagani or a Rolex, it means that this watch means more than just the sum of its parts. It means it makes you feel a certain way. Whether you are a clomage homage wearer who really has a pessimistic view on the luxury buyer because they think that, oh, they're overspending on all of this marketing nonsense and they're getting ripped off. Well, if we're being honest, everyone who's in this hobby is getting ripped off in the objective sense as well. But again, you wear these watches to make you feel something inside, right? And also to whoever is on the luxury side of this argument, looking down on the homage buyers and belittling them because, oh, they're just cheap watches and stuff. The way I would approach this is the fact that homage and clomage watches are actually luxury by definition. If you look at Merriam-Webster's definition of luxury, I will quote them. Luxury is defined as something adding to pleasure or comfort, but not absolutely necessary. And if you think that a Pagani design is necessary, then, I mean, I don't know, but all these mechanical watches are something that adds pleasure to your life. I think that is a perfect way to sum things up. This whole hobby is a luxurious hobby that we all partake in, so there is no real reason to be all up in arms about who bought what and why they bought it. So that's just something I think all watch buyers should keep in mind. And it's not said enough, as I couldn't reiterate it anymore. If you are interested in looking at some of my watch picks and answering some polls, I'm on Watch Crunch and on Instagram. Also, I'll have the links for the Pagani GMT in the description down below. And also, if you're interested, I would recommend checking out my full review on the Pagani GMT. So if you enjoyed this video, I'm so glad you did, because I really try to put in effort into my watch videos and try to improve them every single time. I hope this channel patinates just like your favorite watch, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.